Fourth, the question of City of Jerusalem and its holy places, and finally, the two-state solution. Mr. President, members of the Court, I come to my first point. The Palestinian people have, as the Court itself has recognized, the right to self-determination. This right, which is codified in the two United Nations Human Rights Conventions, is one of the essential principles of contemporary international law. All states have a legal interest in protecting that right, which has the status of jus cogens. Israeli measures that severely impede the exercise by the Palestinian people of the right to self-determination are in breach of Israel's obligations to respect that right. Pakistan strongly believes in the inherent right of people to live freely and in the justice of struggle for freedom from alien subjugation under the right of self-determination. I turn to my second point, the question of Israel's occupation and annexation. It has always been the position of the United Nations that it, and I quote, cannot condone a change in the status juris resulting from military action contrary to the provisions of the Charter. The organization must, therefore, maintain that the status juris existing prior to such military action to be re-established by a withdrawal of troops and by the relinquishment or nullification of rights asserted in territories covered by the military action. End of quote. Thus, after the Six-Day War, the Security Council determined in Resolution 242 of 1967 that Israel must withdraw its armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. In Resolution 476 of 1980, the Security Council reaffirmed the overriding necessity for ending the prolonged occupation of Arab territories occupied by Israel since 1967. Israel's occupation is no longer, if it ever was, a military occupation. It is annexation. In East Jerusalem, the annexation is de jure. In the rest of the territory, it is de facto. But the formal characterization matters little. To use the words of the court in the Wall case, the occupation is today, and I quote, notwithstanding the formal characterization, tantamount to de facto annexation, end of quote. This now applies to the entire territory. This may have been the intention all along. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion affirmed in 1950 that, and I quote, the Israeli empire must comprise all the territories between the Nile and the Euphrates, end of quote. And this was to be achieved as much by invasion as by diplomacy. More recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu has declared that his government will be, and I quote, applying Israeli sovereignty over all the communities formed through the transfer of Israeli settlers, and not one resident or community will be uprooted, end of quote. Through its settlement policy, Israel has sought to create irreversible facts on the ground. It has aimed to create physical facts, which in practical terms make it as difficult as possible to bring an end to its prolonged occupation, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Notwithstanding, the Security Council has reaffirmed that the settlements constitute, and I quote, a flagrant violation under international law, end of quote. As this court said in the Namibia case, a binding determination made by a competent organ of the United Nations to the effect that a situation is illegal cannot remain without consequence. As in that case, in answering the legal questions now referred to it, the court is not concerned with the question of what practical steps would be required to seize the occupation. It is worth recalling, however, that even greater practical issues have been overcome in other contexts, such as when the French government withdrew 1 million settlers from Algeria in 1962. The French settlers were more numerous than the Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem taken together. France's settlements in Algeria were not only more numerous, they were also far older and better established than Israel's West Bank colonies. I come to my third point regarding systematic racial discrimination. Israel's policies and practices amount to systematic racial discrimination and apartheid. Israel has imposed a system of racial discrimination against the Palestinian people since 1967. It is a system that distinguishes deliberately and systematically along ethnic and religious lines between the Palestinian population and Jewish Israeli settlers illegally transferred into the territory. The purpose of domination and oppression may be inferred from Israel's pattern of conduct against the Palestinians. I turn to my fourth point, Jerusalem and its holy places. The holy city of Jerusalem is unique in that it is sacred to all three Abrahamic religions. Under the historic status quo, it is the right of Christian, Jewish and Muslim communities freely to access and worship at their holy places in the city. Ottoman decrees set out these rights in the 19th century. The regime was later confirmed in multilateral and bilateral instruments. The historic status quo has today developed into a so-called objective regime, which captures the point that it is characterized by a permanence which the instruments that established it do not themselves necessarily enjoy. Every state interested, therefore, has the right to insist upon compliance with this regime. Under Israel's prolonged occupation, Christians have not been free to access or worship in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Muslims have not been free to access or worship at Haram al-Sharif and in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to name only some prominent sites. The rights under the historic status quo must immediately be restored. This issue is of great importance to Pakistan, which is home to the second largest Muslim population in the world. And now I come to my final point of the first part of my statement. Pakistan believes that the two-state solution must be the basis for peace. In the Wall case, this court observed that the two-state solution was to be encouraged, and I quote, with a view to achieving as soon as possible, on the basis of international law, a negotiated solution to the outstanding problems and the establishment of a Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel and its other neighbors, with peace and security for all in the region. End of quote. Pakistan supports this call. On 26th of October 2023, Pakistan was pleased to vote in favor of General Assembly resolution which reaffirmed that, and I quote, a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be achieved in accordance with international law and on the basis of the two-state solution. 2 months later, on 22nd of December 2023, the Security Council reiterated its unwavering commitment to the vision of the two states, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions. And these and numerous other resolutions by the political organs of the United Nations make clear a two-state solution and negotiations leading to it must be consistent with international law. Negotiations, Judge Onal Khasani of this court observed in the Wall case, and I quote, are a means to an end and cannot in themselves replace that end, end of quote. He continued to say that the discharge of fundamental international obligations cannot be made conditional upon negotiations. In this regard, the court's advisory opinion in these proceedings will be most important. Far from impeding negotiations in the achievement of a just and lasting two states, the court's advisory opinion will further assist such efforts by making it possible for the parties to make progress on the sound basis of international law and international legitimacy. Mr. President, members of the court, I now turn to more technical legal arguments of my submissions. The court has heard various competing submissions this week with respect to question B of the request. But there can be little doubt as to the central importance of three matters. First, the role of the rules on the use of force in governing the unlawfulness of a given occupation itself. Second, the series of General Assembly and Security Council resolutions that have consistently and expressly called for Israel's withdrawal and referred to the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, which is a corollary of those rules. Third, the court's advisory.
न्यूज़ बुलेटिन फिलहाल इतना ही।
देखते रहिए ARY न्यूज़।
अल-रहमान गार्डन फेज 7 मेडिकल सिटी ही तो है जहां मिले जिंदगी की हर खुशी आपकी खुशियों का ज़ामिन अल-रहमान डेवलपर्स।
ऐसे मेहमान नवाजे हम करो ऊंचा ना प्यारे बाजी आप मेहमान हैं हमारी। ये लो बेटा, वीडियो बनाओ, सबको दिखाओ।
अपनी मेहमान नवाजी से हम पलट रहे हैं पाकिस्तान का खेल। तुम भी फोन उठाओ और जहां PSL वहां HPL।
अल-रहमान गार्डन फेज 7 मेडिकल सिटी ही तो है जहां मिले जिंदगी की हर खुशी आपकी खुशियों का ज़ामिन अल-रहमान डेवलपर्स।
कुछ ही तो दिन हुए शादी को, अभी से कपड़े धोने भेज दिए।
खिला दे कपड़ों के रंग, ये है मेरा नंबर 1 वॉशिंग पाउडर। झाग में दम, धुलाई में नंबर 1।
टाइम की डबल ट्रीट।
जामे शीरी के खालिस इंग्रेडिएंट्स में है नेचुरल बेनिफिट्स जो दूध को बनाए और भी हेल्थी।
ये लोग तो अभी आ रहे हैं, जगह तो डिसाइड ही नहीं की।
मैकडॉनल्ड्स चलते ना आज।
सबको मैकडॉनल्ड्स खिलाओगे?
तो क्या हुआ, दो लूट लो।
शॉपिंग, ट्रैवलिंग हो या ब्यूटी, गो लूट लो से मिले हर चीज पर डिस्काउंट्स। गो लूट लो, खुल के जियो।
जहाँ सकाफत रक्स करती है, जहाँ धरती खजाने उगलती है, वहीं बनता है कमर चाय का खूबसूरत पाकिस्तान।
जब सिर्फ पेंट के पैसे देंगे तो बचत तो होगी। मास्टर पेंट लगवाएं और टोकन के इजाफी खर्चे से छुटकारा पाएं। पेंट के पैसे दो, टोकन के नहीं।
अल रहमान गार्डन फेज 7 मिरेकल सिटी ही तो है, जहाँ मिले जिंदगी की हर खुशी आपकी खुशियों का सामिन। अल रहमान डेवलपर्स।
ब्लीनी है कलर,
बाल डैमेज करता नहीं, स्किन पे चढ़ता नहीं।
ब्लीनी है कलर,
हर रंग में लगो यंग।
Pakistan's latest inverter ceiling fan with 99.9% pure copper and electrical steel sheet. AC/DC inverter RF technology जो दे मार्केट में मौजूद तमाम ब्रांड से बेहतर और भरपूर हवा। सोनेक्स फैंस की BLDC टेक्नोलॉजी के साथ 75% तक बिजली की बचत। सोनेक्स फैन, लेट्स टॉक अबाउट फ्रेशर।
रंगों की दुनिया में सबसे रंगीन एहसास निपॉन पेंट्स। हाईटेक जापानीज टेक्नोलॉजी से बना निपॉन पेंट, एशियाज #1 पेंट ब्रांड।
वीकली एक्स की 100 GBs, स्ट्रीमिंग और हैंडसेट इंश्योरेंस के सुपर पैक बने आपकी सुपर पावर।
This hourly clock is brought to you by
वीकली एक्स की 100 GBs और हैंडसेट इंश्योरेंस बने आपकी सुपर पावर।
सिद्ध के दिल से हलफ उठाता हूँ कि मैं खलूस नीयत से पाकिस्तान का हामी और वफादार रहूंगा।
पंजाब असम्बली के नौमुंतखब अरकान ने हलफ उठा लिया। नून लीग की जानिब से वजीर आला की नामजद उम्मीदवार मरियम नवाज समेत दीगर लीगी रहनुमा, PTI के हिमायत याफ्ता सुन्नी इत्तेहाद काउंसिल और दीगर जमातों के अरकान ने हलफ उठाया। बारी बारी हलफनामे पर दस्तखत किए। स्पीकर सफ्तान खान ने अरकान को मुबारक दी। कहा, अल्लाह आपको एक दूसरे की बात तसल्ली से सुनने का हौसला दे। कल स्पीकर पंजाब असम्बली और डिप्टी स्पीकर का इंतखाब होगा। नामजदगी फॉर्म आज जमा कराए जाएंगे। नून लीग की जानिब से मालिक अहमद खान को स्पीकर का उम्मीदवार नामजद किए जाने का इम्कान।
पंजाब, सिंध और बलूचिस्तान